Hello, and welcome to the podcast, An Intelligent Look at Terrorism. I'm your host, Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada. Okay, here's a skill testing question for primarily my Canadian listeners. I'm pretty sure you've all heard of Thomas D'Arcy McGee. He was one of the so-called fathers of Confederation. Wait, can I use the word fathers of Confederation in 2020, or will I get the thought police after me? Anyhow, Thomas D'Arcy McGee was a politician, played a major role in the creation of this country in 1867. Unfortunately, he didn't live to see a lot of his creation, I wouldn't use that term, but his contribution to this country, because less than a year after Confederation, less than a year after July 1st, 1867, T.D. McGee was assassinated. He was assassinated on what is now Spark Street in downtown Ottawa. It was actually on the 7th of April, 1868. He was only 42 years old, and he was killed by someone that could fairly be called a terrorist. And the particular brand of terrorist, they're called the Fenians. I imagine most Canadians can't spell Fenians, let alone know who they are. So I have brought in Canada's foremost expert on the Fenians, Professor David Wilson of the University of Toronto. He's written several books on the Fenians, as well as an award-winning two-part biography of Thomas D'Arcy McGee himself. So David, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast today.
I'm delighted to be here.
Let's start from first principles then. Who the hell were the Fenians, and what were they all about in the 1850s and 1860s here in Canada and elsewhere?
The Fenians were a group, a secret society of Irish revolutionaries whose goal was to secure a completely independent Republican Ireland. And the Fenian Brotherhood was founded in 1858. It was a transatlantic affair right from the start. It was begun with Irish-American support. It was organized by refugees from an earlier failed rising in 1848, a rising that took place during the famine. And both the failed rising of 1848 and the famine had a massive impact on the people who became Fenians. The famine took place between 1846 and 1851. Ireland's population at the beginning of the famine was about 8 million. At the end, it was down to 6 million. 1 million people died during the famine. Another million emigrated. And
that's a quarter of the population either died or left.
Absolutely massive disruption. And many of the Irish who survived that blamed Britain for the famine. For some, it was what would now be called an act of genocide. This is not a view that modern historians would subscribe to, but in a sense, that's beside the point. The point is that many people who became Fenians believed that it was an act of genocide, including actually Thomas D'Arcy McGee in his earlier radical days. He accused the British government of, quote, 2 million ministerial murders. So doubling the number of people who were killed and calling the British Prime Minister and Cabinet murderers. So this gives you some idea of the intensity of feeling and the anger towards Britain that many Irish people felt, and particularly those who'd been uprooted, who'd been forced or felt forced to cross the Atlantic to flee from the famine, and had bitter memories of their experiences on the so-called coffin ships, an alarmingly high death rate on the transatlantic ships.
I've actually been to the coffin ship, I guess, exhibit or museum. Is it in New Ross, I believe, in Ireland with my wife. In fact, my wife's great-grandparents emigrated to Canada during those years. So my wife and her family, she's a Walsh, and that she's part of that exodus from the famine in the 1850s.
I should say also that not all people who emigrated during the famine became revolutionaries, far from it, but many did. The famine played a huge role in fueling the feelings behind Fenianism, adding to the intensity of the Fenians' views. But also the failed rising of 1848 played a significant part. There were broadly speaking, there were two lessons that you could take from the failure of the 1848 rising. One was the one that Thomas D'Arcy McGee ultimately took, and that is Britain is just too powerful. You cannot defeat Britain by military means. And if you accept that, then any attempt to do so is futile, counterproductive, and must be opposed.
So there must be a better way, obviously.
Yes, yeah, through reform, scaling down your demands, attacking revolutionary extremism, attacking Protestant extremism, and trying to forge a middle course characterized by reform. But the other lesson you could draw from 1848 was, right, boys, we better do it right. We better do it properly next time. So we're going to have a tighter secret organization. This is absolutely central to what follows. An axiom of Irish revolutionary republicanism, going right back to the French Revolutionary era, was England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. Wait until England is involved in a European war. Its troops will be sent overseas. There'll be the space opening up for a revolution in Ireland. And these Irish Republican revolutionaries in the early 19th century pinned all their hopes on France. I mean, France and Britain had fought between 1793 and 1815. They were the great hope for Irish Republican revolutionaries. But France selfishly kept letting the Irish down.
Oh, those perfidious French.
by refusing to go to war with Britain. But there was always the possibility that, to use a modern phrase, you could create new realities on the ground. What if Britain and the United States went to war? That could have a massive effect on Irish republicanism.
Which, of course, they already had it from 1812 to 1815, right?
That's right. And during the Civil War, the American Civil War from 1861 to 65, Britain gave belligerent status to the Confederacy, and the North was extremely upset about that. Relations between the United States and Britain were at a very low ebb. Now, supposing you could take that situation, exacerbate it, and use it to your advantage. And one way you could do this was to promote revolutionary incursions into Canada. This is where Canada entered the picture. It hadn't been in the picture at all when the Fenians were founded in 1858. But it became clear by the mid-1860s that the Secret Service in Ireland, which, such as it was pretty rudimentary, but it was pretty clear that the repressive apparatus of the British government and the Irish administration had repressed the Fenian movement in Ireland. So what was left if you were an Irish Republican revolutionary in the United States? One option was to try and create a situation where the United States and Britain went to war. And if you could invade Canada using Irish American some freebooters, if you like, although they call them soldiers, we can get back to that in a minute. If you could launch an invasion with the tacit approval of the United States, this could provoke a war between the two countries. And that was a major factor, a major strategic factor in the decision of one branch, one wing of the Fenians to adopt the Canadian strategy. The other more emotive factor was the desire for revenge. One of the interesting things about Fenian literature, Fenian speeches, is that they view Canada and England as synonymous. So they'll talk about English jails when they're talking about Fenians imprisoned in Canada.
Interesting.
So the Union Jack flew in Canada. The Union Jack was the British flag. It was all part of the British Empire. And after the Civil War, you've got all these veterans who can't be sent across the Atlantic, Irish-American veterans who can't be sent across the Atlantic because the Royal Navy rules the waves. But Canada appears like a sitting duck on your doorstep. So hence the Canadian strategy.
And actually, wasn't there I'll call it a semi-successful major raid, I forget the year, you would know, of course, from Buffalo. They went into the Niagara Peninsula, got in a few miles or kilometers, and then they kind of fizzled out. Can you talk about that raid by the Fenians?
Certainly. That was the second attempt. There was an earlier one that fizzled out in New Brunswick, or they never actually got into New Brunswick. But
They got stuck in Maine somewhere or something?
That's right. Yes, yes, they did actually. Yeah,
I've been in Eastern Maine. I can see how you can get stuck there very easily.
yeah. I lived in New Brunswick for a while. I know that area quite well. Actually, to digress for a moment, that is a fascinating story, particularly in the subject of spies and informers, and a completely mistaken set of views about how the New Brunswick and Canadian and British governments responded to that attack. But that's another story for another podcast.
Another podcast, exactly.
But you were talking about the raid from Buffalo into the Niagara Peninsula. That was at the beginning of June of 1866. It actually caught the Canadian Secret Police, the newly formed Canadian Secret Police, completely by surprise. So it's often said that the Fenians were no good at secrecy, that they leaked like sieves. That's not entirely true. They were able to keep their plans clandestine at the beginning of June 1866. And they came across with somewhere in the region of 800 and 1,000 men. And
that's not insignificant.
It's not insignificant. No, and the logistics of doing that are, quite impressive, actually. Although it fell far short of their overall plan, which was to have a three-pronged attack on Canada. The logistics proved insuperable. But 800 to 1,000 came in, and the Canadian militia were very hastily assembled, and the main groups that came down were from Hamilton and Toronto. A lot of them were actually University of Toronto students in the Queen's Own Rifles.
Not some of your students, obviously.
Pardon?
Not some of your current students.
No, they're not that old. It is actually noteworthy that none of their professors joined them.
I won't go down that road. How's that?
Perhaps just as well. Anyway, these were raw, untrained troops fighting Civil War veterans who were very experienced, and they were actually lured into a trap at Ridgeway. And ironically, actually, had not the leader of the Canadian militia, Colonel Booker, had he not panicked and ordered the retreat, the slaughter would have been even greater. As it was, there were probably around a dozen or slightly more people killed on the Canadian side. A few Fenians were killed as well. And then as British troops began to advance towards the Niagara Peninsula, and as it became clear that the other prongs of the Fenian attack had failed to materialize, the leader of the raid, General John O'Neill, who later became president of the Fenian Brotherhood, decided that the most prudent course of action would be to retreat. But what's really interesting about this is that when you look at how this was viewed in even moderate Irish nationalist newspapers, they were absolutely ecstatic about what happened, because for the first time since 1798, the boys in green had defeated the boys in red in open conflict, in open combat. So even people who'd been opposed to the Fenian raids found themselves, despite themselves, supporting what had happened and admiring the lads. So this actually tells us something. This told the Fenians something as well. It tells us that the strategy of trying to provoke an Anglo-American war while galvanizing revolutionary sentiment in Ireland was not totally off the mark. What the Fenians didn't know was that the American government was leading them on. The American government made noises. The Fenians believed that the president, Andrew Johnson, had said, we will recognize accomplished facts, but that he would never put it in writing. So they believed that they had the tacit approval of the United States government. They did not. The American government did not want to lose the Irish vote. and it didn't believe the Fenians would actually go through with an attack on Canada. So they were prepared to say pretty much what they needed to say or thought they needed to say to get the Irish-American vote. In practice, they were working with the British minister in Washington, with the approval of the British government, to make sure that, if possible, an attack would be prevented. And if one did take place, reinforcements would not be allowed to come through.
Those nasty Americans. This may be an unfair question to ask you, David, but looking back to the mid-1860s, so before Canada became Canada per se, how would you typify the nature and scale of the threat by the Fenians to British North America during that time period? Was it really just a pinprick, sort of a little gnat on the shoulder of British North America, or could it have been, as you've been sort of alluding to, I think, it could have been actually much more serious?
It could have been more serious, much more serious, perhaps not. There was no way that Irish Fenians were going to take over Canada. That was just not going to happen. They misread the situation in Canada, as well as misreading the American government's position. They believed that French Canadians, fellow Catholics trapped in an alien British Empire, would at the very least be neutral and quite possibly join them. And they believed that Irish Catholics, and there were many of them in Canada at that time, would also either be neutral or join them. And indeed, a minority of Irish Catholics did support the Fenian Brotherhood, which is one of the things I've been working on actually in my most recent book, Fenianism inside Canada. But they were not strong enough in and of themselves to actually conquer Canada, but they were strong enough and potentially strong enough to do quite a lot of damage. Economic damage. I mean, the cost of calling out the militia regularly, because it was just one alarm after another. I mean, this went on for 5 years, from 1866 through to 1870, when there was another invasion attempt in May of 1870. And there was always the possibility that the Fenians could get a foothold in Canada if they could just hold it for a week. And if the American government was prepared to look the other way, that more Irish Americans would come and join them, and they would have done. I mean, they absolutely would have done. So they could have produced a situation in which much more blood was shed. But in my view, it was ultimately a futile cause. Having said that, I mean, you have to put yourself in the position of the Fenians who supported the invasion if you're going to understand them. Otherwise, you're just going to ridicule them as having this harebrained scheme to liberate Ireland by invading Canada. What are you guys smoking? But from their perspective, given the assumptions they made, which we in retrospect know were false assumptions about Irish Canadians, about French Canadians, about the American government, their position.
It made sense for them.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
Sure.
There's this age-old argument about freedom fighters versus terrorists. We have Ronald Reagan to thank of the one man's terrorist and another man's freedom fighter. Where do you stand on the issue of the Fenians? Were they terrorists or were they freedom fighters?
Well, you see me on the spot, and now you see me take one step off it. From the perspective of the Fenians themselves, of course, they were freedom fighters. From the perspective of Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who had once been a freedom fighter himself, he had been a revolutionary leader in 1848. He was actually the most visceral opponent of the Fenians in Canada, outreaching the Orange Order in his denunciations of the...
That's saying something.
Yeah, he attacked the Orange Order too, but that's a different story. But no, for him, they were irreligious, they were immoral. He didn't actually use the word terrorist, but he described them as sowing terror among peaceable Canadians, that there was absolutely no justification for what they were doing. that they were deluded followers of self-interested men. This was his approach. And after there were prisoners taken, Fenian prisoners taken after the Battle of Ridgeway in the Niagara Peninsula, about 16 of them were given the death sentence.
Oh, really?
Now the British government was extremely worried about this because they thought these martyrs, as they would become, would only intensify Fenian anger and play into the hands of the Fenian Brotherhood. They did not want anyone to be executed, and they let the Canadian government know this. And the Canadian government waited a while, and 5 months later said, we're commuting the sentences to long prison sentences. McGee gave a speech that November of 1866 in which he said, in which he announced the commutation. And then this was to an Irish Montreal audience. And Montreal was a Fenian, parts of Montreal, Griffintown, for example, was a Fenian hotbed. And he gave this speech in which he said, and I quote, "These men deserve death." Now, this was hardly a moderate position to take, you know. These men deserve death. And he was booed by a section of the audience. And then he said, he pointed at them and he said, "I have evidence against you that could put you exactly where the Fenians are, but I choose not to use it. You are not worth it." You know, so this was really combative talk. That's one of the reasons why he wound up being assassinated.
Well, let's pick up on that then, David. So, of course, you know, I talk a lot about Thomas D'Arcy McGee. I've been by the plaque it's on Queen Street in Ottawa, so 1 block south of Spark Street, 2 blocks south of Parliament, approximately the site where he would have been assassinated in 1868. James Whelan was arrested, he was convicted, and he was hanged. But there was some kind of debate whether or not either James Whelan was the Fenian, or if in fact the Fenians were responsible for Thomas D'Arcy McGee's death. From your perspective, being a scholar on this movement, was T.D. McGee in fact killed by a Fenian terrorist / freedom fighter?
We will never know with absolute certainty, but there is, to me, overwhelming circumstantial evidence to indicate that Jim Whelan was indeed a Fenian, certainly in sympathy, if not actually a sworn member of the Fenian Brotherhood, although I suspect he was that as well. And there is overwhelming circumstantial evidence that McGee was assassinated by Fenians. Whether he was actually assassinated by Jim Whelan, it's just a slightly different question.
Yeah, I've seen some of the debate on that, whether or not he was actually the guy that pulled the trigger.
Yeah, now one thing I think we can say for sure is that this was not an authorized Fenian hit from New York headquarters. There was actually a Fenian assassination squad in Dublin, but there seems to have been no equivalent to that in New York, where Fenian headquarters were. But I think what you have is Jim Whelan and a group of his friends, and they're artisans basically. You know, Whelan's a tailor. Some of his friends are beer carters. You know, they hang out in Kate Scanlon's pub in Montreal, and which is McGee's base. And they hate McGee. There's just a lot of evidence. And there was a very hard-fought election after Confederation, where there's actually, I'll just elaborate on this a little because it's a very interesting story. McGee's principal opponent in this election in Montreal West was a man named Barney Devlin. Now, in 1848, a group called the Irish Republican Union from New York had ideas about invading Canada back then in 1848. And Barney Devlin, a young lawyer, went down to New York, Vauxhall Gardens, and gave a speech in which he said, "We invite you to come up. Come up, and you'll always get a cadmil fulcher from us. You'll get 1,000 million welcomes from us." I said, "I can't see any more than that because I'm going back to Canada, but come and join us. You'll be very welcome." So now in 1867, with Fenian support, Barney Devlin says, "I am the same person now that I was in 1848. McGee's turned traitor, called him a traitor, you know, but I'm the same." So this was a viciously fought election. On the one side, Barney Devlin and his Fenian supporters threatened to break heads. This is public polling, so it's no secret ballot.
Right.
On the other hand, McGee's financial friends threatened to fire people who voted for Barney Devlin. So there's economic intimidation on one side and physical intimidation on the other. And in the course of this, McGee wrote a series of articles in which he exposed Fenianism in Canada using Secret Service reports. And once he did that, the outrage among Fenians and Fenian supporters in Montreal and in Canada generally, and indeed in North America generally, was intense, because McGee had committed the greatest sin an Irish person could commit. He was consorting with informers and drawing on their information. And in one speech that Devlin gave, he said, Whelan is a foul, corrupt informer. And a voice from the crowd called out, "He's dead." Mm-hmm. Now we don't know that that voice was Jim Whelan's, although he was in Montreal at the time, but we know he said similar things. Okay. From I think, reliable witnesses at the trial. There were some witnesses who were not quite so reliable, and there was a lot of lying on both sides of that trial. But there were some whose credibility was never tested, and it's clear that from their evidence that Whelan twice went up to McGee's home with the intention, with a friend, with the intention of assassinating McGee. There's also evidence to suggest that Whelan intended to assassinate McGee on New Year's night, 1868. Now, the question becomes, the circumstantial evidence against Whelan, in my view, is very strong. I mean, there'll be people who disagree with me, and it'd be actually really good to have them on your podcast at some stage, and we could have the debate. But what I think might have happened on April the 6th, 7th, or 2 in the morning, April 7th, 1868 in Spark Street. And this is where I move into the realm of conjecture. I can give you reasons why I think this is what happened. But I think Whelan had been intending to assassinate McGee that night. Whelan always swore that he always swore that he was innocent. Well, everyone does that. Mm-hmm. But even after the death sentence had been finalized and all appeals had run out, he still swore he was innocent. He told his wife that he knew who killed McGee, but he would never tell anyone. He told the police magistrate and the Crown Attorney, James O'Reilly, the night before he was executed, that he was there when McGee was assassinated. He was present at the assassination, and he still denied that he pulled the trigger. Mm-hmm. When McGee's wife told him, or conveyed the message, "Tell him I forgive him," which, by the way, she did not, but she conveyed that message. His reply was, "Tell Mrs. McGee I have no reason to be forgiven because I did not shoot that man." Now, this is very interesting. We know that, or it's pretty clear that on 3 occasions he'd intended to assassinate McGee but couldn't go through with it. Piecing the evidence together, I found the most likely person to have been with him late that night was a man named James Kinsella, who did give evidence at the trial, and it was really confused and contradictory, and no one's paid much attention to it. But there's some evidence to suggest that he would have been there with McGee. What I suspect might have happened is that Whelan couldn't go through with it. Kinsella took the gun from him and said, "Here, give that to me," and did the job for him. It's consistent with a lot of things. It's not consistent with everything. It's also consistent with the notion that a group of, if you like, freelance Fenians were responsible for this act.
So I guess the bottom line is that Thomas D'Arcy McGee was killed by someone, either Jim Whelan or this Kinsella, but in large part because of his pronouncements against the Fenians, would actually make him Canada's first victim of a terrorist attack less than 1 year after our initial birthday.
I think there's little doubt of that. I would say that the views of who killed McGee and why became a kind of Rorschach test immediately after the assassination. So the Fenians said it was a mad Englishman named Dent who committed suicide the day afterwards. Other Fenians said it was informers. McGee, and there's some historians who still believe this, very few of them, but some think that that McGee's own informers were afraid that he was going to reveal their names and shot him. One person even thinks that John A. Macdonald organized the hit.
This isn't a conspiracy podcast, David. We're not going to go down that pathway.
I think we can safely rule that one out.
So moving forward, you have this movement that dates from the middle part of the 19th century. Of course, Irish nationalism morphed into something quite different in the early 20th century with the rise of the Irish Republican Army. Of course, we have the Troubles in the 60s and 70s. We have the bombings in the United Kingdom. We have the killings. So to this day, we have, was it the real IRA, the provisional? We have more IRAs than I can think of. In your perspective as a historian, do you think the Fenians were the direct or spiritual precursors of the IRA?
They were the IRA.
They were the IRA.
They called themselves the IRA. They called themselves the Irish Republican Army. They had their own uniforms and they had buttons with IRA on them. They sent dispatches from Buffalo, IRA left wing, dispatches from Malone in New York, IRA right wing. These are geographical rather than political denotations. They were the IRA. The IRA was first operative in North America, and its first actions occurred in Canada. And moving forward, there is a direct line from the revolutionary republicanism of the men who styled themselves the Irish Republican Army in the United States and the Irish Republican Army that fought in the streets of Northern Ireland to put bombs in Britain during the 1970s and 80s and 90s.
So why is it, though, that most people would date the creation or the founding of the IRA to, 1916, 1917, during the First World War? That's when we say this is the IRA finally took shape. Why are we ignoring this 50 years or so of Fenian republicanism in North America?
Because it's an ideological continuity rather than a military continuity. That's the reason that the IRA of 1866 to 1870 ceased to exist as a military organization after 1870. But the ideology that underpinned that IRA is the same ideology that was carried forward through secret societies in the late 19th century. You know, the Whelan and the early 20th century, the Whelan bomb canal. You know, the Whelan canal was bombed, and that could have been very serious indeed. Had the town of Merison could have been flooded had that bomb gone off in the way it was expected to go off. That was a revolutionary Irish Republican plot during the Boer War, to try and damage the empire. And even during, this is actually something that's absolutely astonishing to me, but it's nonetheless true. Even during the First World War and its immediate aftermath, there were intelligence reports in Montreal, particularly, indicating that Irish revolutionary groups were planning to work with Germans to create maximum damage to British sites, British ports, British infrastructure in Canada during the war to help the cause of Germany and Irish freedom. As it was, the Germans and the Irish couldn't get their acts together. They couldn't. Each regarded the other as being more oppressed, and they couldn't organize anything. But the same dynamic was at work. Irish Republicans in Canada plotting with their counterparts in the United States to try and do damage to British interests in North America. That runs right through to 1919, 1920. Mm-hmm. So that's an interesting side of the story too. But on the Irish and American side, secret societies in the late 19th century, and then the Irish Republican Brotherhood mm-hmm. begins to organize through, it's a complex issue that I won't go into, but I'll just say, on the eve of the First World War, as tensions were growing in Ireland over whether or not Ireland should have home rule, mm-hmm. with Irish Catholics mm-hmm. supporting it and Irish Protestants opposing it, each group formed its own set of volunteers, a military group, one to put pressure on Britain to bring about home rule, the first one, to put pressure on Britain to stop home rule. And out of that militarization emerged the IRA as a military force mm-hmm. from the Irish Republican Brotherhood. Mm-hmm. That's why it's related to 1916.
And of course, we all know that the support that came from the Irish community in the United States for decades was primordial to the IRA effort in Northern Ireland and Ireland for many, many years, right? They did rely on that expat community from the safety of the New England for the most part, sending money and material back and forth to the fight in Ireland.
They did, and there were Canadian elements there too. Exactly. There was a Canadian who was arrested for trying to get missiles, anti-helicopter missiles from the United States to Ireland. And he got off because of entrapment, which is an interesting story. But also another side of this that's not known, and eventually historians will, I think, be able to start working on it, is that loyalist terrorism had strong supporters in parts of Canada as well, running arms to loyalist paramilitary groups and sending money to loyalist paramilitary groups. So you're getting both sides of the picture. The Republican side is better known, but there was a loyalist side as well that I think we need to keep in mind.
David, this has been fascinating. You've shown the world yet again that Canada is not the home only of peace, order, and good government, but is also the haven sometimes of some pretty nasty actors. I want to thank you for being part of the podcast, but before I let you go, can you tell my listeners what you're working on and when you hope to publish your next book?
Certainly. I'm in the closing stages of a book called Double Lives, Spies, Informers, Irish Revolutionaries, and Canadian Secret Policemen. And it's on the origins of the Canadian Secret Police Force and the counterintelligence activities that they developed to fight Fenianism within the United States and within Canada. It'll be coming out with McGill Queen's University Press, and I'll have the book finished by Christmas, so 2021 or 2022. Publishers' wheels turn very slowly. We shall see.
I know that from my own books. I will be one of your first purchasers, and I would like to have it signed. I can also sense we're going to have to get together at some point and talk about that in a future podcast, because of course that's fascinating to me as somebody who used to work for CSIS. Although I never did work the Irish Republican problem myself, but I had colleagues who did. So again, David, thank you for taking the time, and I wish you all the best during this COVID pandemic.
And to you. Thank you very much, Phil.
That was my conversation with David Wilson on the Fenian terrorists/freedom fighters in Canada. Let me know what you think. You can reach me on email, borealisrisk@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisSaves. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Facebook. If you like this content, please go to my website, www.borealisthreatrisk.com. Hit the subscribe button. Give me your information. You get a free digest every morning. Podcasts such as this, shorter quick hits podcasts, media interviews, blogs, etc., all into your inbox, free of charge, first thing every morning. I'd love to hear from you. I'll talk to you again soon. Stay safe.